Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast, kind of been my friend for a long time that I've actually never talked to the way we're going to talk in this podcast, and he's going to talk about his new book, is my friend Chris Kimball. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you. It's good to meet you. I know this is all audio, but Richard, face to face.
It is good. Do you go by Christian or Chris for our listeners?
This will be a longer answer than you want. I go by Chris. I go by Christian. I go by Christian E. Kimball. When we got to the publishing for this book, the publisher came back to me and said, the way Amazon works, you're going to have to pick a name and use that forever for anything you publish or write. And so we decided, since I'd been using Christian E. Kimball professionally in my legal practice for years and years, we decided for publication in the Mormon sphere, we would use Christian Kimball. But I go by Chris most of the time with my friends.
I'm glad I asked that question. That was a very thoughtful and helpful answer. Just to introduce my friend Chris, he's a lawyer by profession. He's in his mid-60s. He's a married father of 3. He's going to talk about his story as a Latter-day Saint, serving as a bishop while I'm teaching law school at Boston University. This is about 25 years ago. And then being released from being bishop and turned in his temple recommend, but didn't turn in his church membership and has stayed a member of the church, attending consistently, and but not having a temple recommend. He'll talk about why that's been his path forward. And either Chris or I are suggesting that's your path forward. Chris is not prescriptive, but it's sharing his story. And the name of his book is called Living on the Inside of the Edge, a survival guide. So we hope this podcast will be helpful for those of you that are sort of struggling to stay in the church and actually want to stay in the church. And maybe something Chris shares with you in this podcast or his book will give you principles to be able to stay if that's your goal. And the podcast might be helpful for those of you that have people that you love and care about that want to stay, and you're kind of working to develop a new set of tools to help them. And so what we thought we'd do is, Chris has got this story I wanted you to hear in the first part of the podcast, and then he's going to talk about the book, the reason he wrote the book, where to get the book, and what's the book in the book. And it's our prayer this will be helpful for you. Just on a personal note, Chris has been a mentor to me. He's going to talk about a Facebook group that he's a moderator of that I joined when I was in what I call my mini faith crisis. And it was mentors like Chris that had a steady voice in this space, and I wanted to find a way to stay that helped me to have a principles-based approach to move forward as I wanted to stay. So I'm grateful for Chris. And if I could go through the Zoom camera and give him a hug, I probably would, because he's helped me. So is that okay for an introduction, Chris?
That's great. And I'd appreciate a hug. The Zoom won't let us do that, but yes. Can I jump into a story?
Yes, jump in. And Chris lives in Utah right now. I may not have mentioned that he is no longer in Massachusetts. He's lived in Chicago, but he's joining us from his home in the mountains of Utah. And it's all yours, Chris.
And for home, it's been Boston, it's been Chicago, sometime in Washington, D.C., and a lot of time now in Utah. For purposes of this book, for this interview, I could tell a life story that would take us days. But what I'd like to do is tell the story in a way that emphasizes an all-in 40 years and a on the edge 25 plus years. That's a not unique story, but I think it's an unusual pattern, and I believe it positioned me to write this particular book. So those are the parts I like to emphasize. I'm about as inside an insider as you could get. Multi-generation Mormon families on both sides. My grandfather was Spencer W. Kimball. My father was, for all the life I can remember, a bishop in the bishopric, in the stake presidency. We were active. At the same time, my father was a writer of church history. He was one of the early board members and editors for Dialogue. We were a well-educated in church matters and church history, family kinds of things that we would talk about over the dinner table. One brief story that will illustrate how much of an insider I was growing up. When I was 10 days shy of 12 years old, the ward in Madison, Wisconsin was going to visit Nauvoo, the youth. And because my dad was in the bishopric, and he was going as a leader, I was going along. And Dad arranged with his cousin, who was a big wheel in the Nauvoo restoration program, and with his father, who was Spencer W. Kimball, then an apostle, that he would ordain me a deacon to the Aaronic priesthood. And sitting in Heber C. Kimball's chair in the study of the Heber C. Kimball home in Nauvoo, which was otherwise cordoned off. So 11 days shy of 12 years old,
Wow.
I was ordained a deacon by my father at my grandfather's permission in my great-great-grandfather's chair.
Wow.
That's an insider, if you will. Rapid forward to the 1990s, I had been a missionary, married in the temple, elders quorum president in multiple wards, high counselor in 2 different stakes with 3 different stake presidents, kind of done it all, working in the temple, other kinds of assignments, all the things you would check off as a fully active, engaged, white, male, fast track church leader. That's how it would have looked and did look. In the mid 1990s, I was called as bishop for the university ward in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was the ward my wife and I had met in as single students back in the 70s. You've already told my age, so we can move forward with that. So I got to be a bishop back in the ward where we met, where I had grown up as a student. And we split the ward, and I ended up being the bishop of the older half that we called the Longfellow Park ward.
Yeah, I've been to that ward. It still exists. I've been in that ward in the last 2 years as a visitor.
And it's an unusual ward in that it's single adults, basically 25 and older, which is works in that area. I think it works well. I don't think that's the most common way to create single adult wards, but I think it works really well. So I had that assignment. It was a 2-year assignment as kind of by the book. I know that there are lots of variations, but that was a 2-year assignment. And it was stressful. The stresses are a much longer story, which I will defer because that's not key to this particular conversation, I guess. Got to the end of that time, and now I'm going to move to the edgy part of my life. That's 40 years, about as all in as it's possible to be. Get to the end of my time as bishop, I'm released and have some. I know lots of issues. I have lots of intellectual issues. I have lots of issues with history. There have been a number of events that have really shaken my commitment. The September 6th excommunications just a few years earlier were my friends being excommunicated. I mean, that was my peer group. That was really hard. That felt like the church kicking people out who were people I cared about, people who mattered to me. There were other experiences, but the crunch, the real hard point for me with respect to church activity, regular, consistent, by the book church activity, came as I was thinking about the Temple Recommend interview, as a matter of fact, which I had done several hundred of in the previous 2 years and had found extremely stressful. I had come to the conclusion that those interviews didn't make sense. They were asking the wrong questions, that I didn't know the answers, that they were incoherent. And as I was contemplating and praying about and thinking about the whole Temple Recommend interview process, my body, my knees started shaking. My body witnessed to me, you will not do that. You will not walk into that room for an interview. And that became the crunch for me. I paid attention. And that, so it isn't as though there's an intellectual, this doesn't make sense. I can go through all kinds of issues like that. For me, there was a physical manifestation. You will not walk into that room and sit for an interview. And I still feel that way today. I once in a while ask my body, how are you feeling? And the answer is still that my knees shake and I will not do it. And it's a trauma response. I understand that, but it's real. It is how I have processed this. The whole worthiness interview function of current church practice. And I simply can't and won't participate. As a matter of consistency, thinking as a matter of personal integrity, I took my Temple Recommend saying, I'm not going to do this anymore. I took my Temple Recommend to a man who was, like my next door neighbor friend, who was my then bishop, and handed it to him with a small note saying, I'm not going to do interviews anymore. And so to be consistent, here it is. We're still in touch. We never talked about that event. It may come up later. I'm still, he's actually important in my life in some other ways, but that's sort of not relevant. In the same context, coming off that time as a bishop and some of the other experiences I had at that time left me very angry about the church. And I want to say that because once in a while, now that in the 20 teens and 2020s, I'm talking, writing books, communicating, participating in conversation, people sometimes come back to me and say, you got it all figured out. You've made peace. You know what you're doing. It looks easy. And I remind myself, and I remind them sometimes, that after 1996, there is in my life a period of about 10 years when I was so angry about the church that I still went to church. But when I walked into the building, the whole front of the chapel looked red in my eye. It was like it was draped in red that registered in my head as anger. I am just angry about all of this. And I silenced myself. I made a decision not to talk. I mean, later, a good friend who became my bishop, as people move around, I mean, in my peer group, lots of my friends have been bishops at different times. And that's, it's an interesting experience to trade off. I'm going to be your bishop this year and you'll be my bishop next year, that kind of thing. One of my friends, become bishop, counseled me, said, you have a lot of things to say about difficulties and anger, but I would counsel you when you're at church, when you're participating, if you're going to speak at all, that you speak of Christ and Him crucified, in the words of Paul. And I took that to heart. I thought that was really good advice. And that got me through some more years. That period, those 10 years, and then the subsequent 10 years, involved a lot of introspection, a lot of learning about, because I wasn't gone. Hadn't left the church I was attending. Once in a while, I would be asked to teach gospel doctrine. I sometimes got callings that I wouldn't accept. Sometimes whenever I was asked to teach, I would, on the condition that I would teach my way. That's actually a chapter in the book, by the way. But I spent a couple of decades figuring out how to make this work. And in effect, that learning how to make it work turns into this book, so that it's not a matter of me sitting as an academic thinking what would make sense. It's me having lived that life for decades, working it out, talking with people, wrestling with how does life work on the inside of the edge. I don't have a temple recommend. I don't do worthiness interviews. I am open and straight with my bishops over time about that role. I communicate with, I talk with my bishops. I pretty much peer-to-peer kind of conversation. Having anybody who's been a bishop has a different kind of conversation with their current bishop than most people who haven't been. And in fact, that's one of the things I want to encourage people to learn for themselves, is to talk with their bishop like they would if they'd had that experience and they were on both sides of the table at different times of their life. So now let's roll forward. That's I would say enough about me, but that's you'll see. Roll forward to 2015. 2015 is a key point in history for me and for a lot of my friends, and I think for the church. 2015, November 5th, the fact that there was an exclusion policy, that the church had a policy of excluding gay people who were married or who wanted to be married, not baptizing children of gay parents, became public. I know a fair amount about how that became public, but that's not relevant immediately. It became public. We learned about it, and that was a shocker. I mean, that was really hard on me and led to some soul searching for myself and with friends in conversation about what are we going to do. And we watched people leave the church. I mean, my friends walked away, many resigning formally, others just stopping participation, whether they took a formal step or not, just leaving. And two key things happened. I mean, that event led to two key things for purposes of this book. One is that a man named Steve Evans, who we only knew each other by reputation and online sort of bloggernacle comments and posts. Steve, I don't know to this day what caused him to think of me, but he wrote me a note. He wrote me a note and said, "We are watching our friends leave the church. We need to write a book." That planted the seed. I mean, the book didn't happen for years later, but that planted the seed of there is something to be done. There is something that needs to happen, and that stuck in my mind. Steve, it turns out, is the proprietor of BCC Press. So when I did write a book, I went back to him and basically said, "You want to publish this? This is what I took from that comment years ago." Um, the other thing that happened that was really critical is that I had been, I had silenced myself. Nobody, no church leader ever told me to, ever disciplined, ever said, you must do, you must not do. I did have that counsel from a bishop saying, I counsel you to talk about Christ when you're at church. And I took that as good counsel, but it wasn't a command. It was, and that didn't happen. But I had done it to myself. I had silenced myself. I had shut myself down. And as I thought about what am I going to do about this exclusion policy, I am really angry. I am really, I mean, in my wife's words, crying tears in my, um, I mean, there's actually a bit of poetry in the book that from that period. Um, in talking with my friends, some of whom left, some of whom stayed, my conclusion was that I would stay, partly because I was already so far out that there really wasn't any farther out to go. I mean, it was sort of, you've already taken all those steps. You're so far out on the fringe. There's not much more to do. But I would stay on the condition that I would speak up, that I would no longer be silent, and that wherever the chips may fall, whatever it would help or hurt, I would tell my story. I would speak up. When I disagreed with something, I would say so. And I have, from that point on, been writing, counseling, essays, commentary. I don't know that it had wide circulation until this book. But without that decision, that sort of a condition of staying is that I would speak, this book wouldn't happen. Without Steve Evans saying we need to write a book, this book wouldn't happen. So that's a turning point. That's sort of a sharp jab. It's not like a happy thing. It's a sharp jab to say get on with it. And that's yeah. There's a story. Now we're to the book. Let me then talk about, because the book didn't happen immediately. The next key thing that happened is that there's a story about how I found it, but I joined this Waters of Mormon group online on Facebook. Waters of Mormon is a private group. I mean, it has had different names over time. It's heavily vetted. That is, people apply, and I understand you're going to provide a link.
Yes.
But I want to talk about that vetting process because I participated at Waters of Mormon for years. And after a period of years, I became a moderator. I've done vetting. I have been active there, talking and writing. And that was a very important developmental stage for me in two ways. One is that I wrote things that people seemed to pay attention to. And that said to me, oh, maybe I have a voice that matters. And some of that turned into parts of the book. Another is that the vetting process helped me define an audience. Waters of Mormon is very careful about who enters and who joins, and there are basically two requirements. One is that the person applying be in crisis, however they define it, that it's about them, that they have really hard times, they're wrestling, they're working, they're hurting. This is not a place for people who want to watch what's happening, who are just curious. It's a place for people talking about themselves. What's hard? What's hurting? How are they going to cope? And So I don't really like the word crisis, and we talk about that, but pretty much to be an appropriate participant at Waters of Mormon, you have to be in crisis. I mean, you have to be working on your own stuff, and that's the first definition. The second definition is that you want to engage, that you are at the moment trying to find a way to stay engaged with the church. And I was in that life, but I didn't know that there were others. And I am not sure that most of the church world is aware that there are thousands of people like that, thousands of people who are in a faith crisis, whatever label they use, but want to find a way to stay. And in fact, the reception of my book is telling me, because it's doing pretty well. I mean, people are paying attention and people are buying, and it's
they are.
it's on the best. It's number one bestseller in New Mormon releases. So what that's telling me is that the number of people in that audience who are troubled, who have questions, who are wrestling, but want to find a way to work with the church, who want to find a way to say, is a bigger audience than anybody knew, than anybody knows even today. And I am curious, but clearly that's my audience. That's the people I'm talking to. And participating at Waters of Mormon and vetting and seeing, oh, sure, there are people who are just curious, and we send them away. There are people who are on the road out and are just looking for a way station as they leave the church, and we send them away. They're not going to get a benefit from that group, and they're not going to like it. It's the questions about who's participating are not. They're not questions about whether you're a good person or not a good person. They're questions about whether you're a good fit, whether you're a fit for what that group is trying to do. And that, by the way, that vetting process is pretty tough. People ask a lot of kind of personal questions, and it is a process that says no, as not as often as it says yes. People pretty much sort themselves out to come, but I think it's important to know that that's both a serious vetting process and that there are hundreds, thousands of people who fit that model, and that became a place where I learned a lot, where I had hundreds of conversations, and that became my target audience. That helped define the audience. And I really believe that that's a necessary part of writing a book. It is not a book that works or a book that helps or a book that is has an audience is to define your audience. And I've tried to pare away. There are lots of people who will never care, will not be interested, will not want this book. I've targeted a narrow audience. I think we're discovering that audience is larger than we thought it might be. I mean, I wrote this as a niche offering to people I know, to my friends and companions on this journey. But and that's a couple thousand people, so that was worth writing a book for. But I think that audience is bigger than that. And let's see. Until you interrupt me with a question, Richard, I'm gonna go on, because with respect to that audience, here's what's interesting as an author and getting a book out for that audience. I felt like I needed to tell them two things. I need to tell them, you, whoever you're listening, this book is not going to tell you to leave the church. And this book is not going to tell you to stay. And it's not going to harangue you and tell you have to stay or here's why you should stay. The audience is defined by people who have real issues but want to stay. I mean, you come to the book already with those two qualifications. And I'm not going to preach. We're going to talk about how to make it work. And that's I think that's an important distinction because almost everything I see that gets written or that gets said over the pulpit or that gets said by ex-Mormons or by people who are really angry about the church has either the characteristic of, we're going to tell you why you have to stay, or we're going to tell you why you have to leave. And I'm assuming you've sorted that out for yourself, and I'm not going to, it's not my business. You work your path. But if you are in that defined category, we're going to talk about it. And what I'm finding is that audience, those people, know almost instantly that they want this book. I mean, I don't have to do any hard sell. I just have to tell them what it's about. I almost have to just show them the title, and then there'll be a question about, did you do a good job or did you do a bad job? And there can I understand the language and is it written reasonably well? But as soon as that target audience knows what the book's about, they want it. And it's because it's intended as a fit for that narrow but widening, broadening audience. I think the other big distinction. Well, let me back up. I mean, there is a criticism I've heard already, which is this book didn't convince me to stay, and I sort of laugh, but that wasn't the job. That wasn't what this book was about in the first place. So, I get it. You're still on your way out, but that's your decision. The other big distinction is that this actually turns into a number of conversations. This book doesn't criticize the church. I've got plenty to say on that front if you want another book, a different book, but that's not this book. This book is not about what's wrong with the church or how to fix the church or it is, I mean, you can come up with some ideas when you read and say, it just shouldn't be this hard. You could say, I wish that would be different. I wish that would change. But I find, because I'm focused on the individual, I'm focused on what can you do? How can you survive? How can you make it work? The idea of fixing the church or criticizing the church it's a different book. It's a different conversation. And plenty of people are actually doing that. I don't need to add to that pile. I do find that people want that. And so I get some criticism saying, well, that's what I wanted. I wanted 250 pages of dissing on the church, and I didn't get that. Well, no, so the book isn't for you. I mean, go get another book. That's part of me defining an audience and trying to stick to it. The other, I guess, the last thing I'll say on that audience is that I really tried not to be prescriptive. I tried not to tell people what to do. I tried to give alternatives. I mean, one of my key principles is break the binaries, that we get stuck in or out. You're all in or you're out. It's true or it's not true. Obey or disobey. That all those binaries get people caught, stuck. I think they are damaging, actually, especially to people who are trying to work a path of awake awareness of issues and problems, but wanting to stay engaged in some fashion. Those binaries just kill you. And so one of the principles is break those binaries. But I don't want to then turn around and say, well, don't deal with obey or disobey, but do it my way. What I've tried to do over and over is say, well, not those binaries, but here's 5 options. And if I can come up with 5 options, you can come up with some more. But their middle way is not a third way. Middle way is individual decision in an almost infinite variety of ways. And that's how I try to work it. At the same time, I felt it very important that I be present, that I be not an ivory tower academic about this, but that I be present because I really am. I mean, this is my journey too. I'm in process. I'm working this same road. And so while I hesitated and I edited myself a dozen times in the book, I will say, and here's where I am right now, and I'm working this same. I mean, here's 5 options, and this happens to be the one I'm working on. That's not to be prescriptive and say you should be. It's just to say, I'm on this same road. I'm working this journey. And this is real life in real time. Uh, I I think that's a strength. I could imagine it being criticized, but I didn't think I could do this book any other way. I felt like I had to be fully present in the story.
On behalf of our listeners, Chris, I've just enjoyed this. I've been glad not to say anything because I'm just sort of on the edge of my chair. And you're a very gifted communicator, as well as telling a really powerful story and framing up the book. The word I want to use is grace. And I get emotional. There's so much grace in what you said. This is my story. And these are the principles that have helped me. I've wanted to stay. And if you want to stay, I'm just sharing my personal story, which takes some real courage. You shared that in private groups, but to share it in a book and a podcast that anybody can listen to takes some courage. But then to write it from the perspective of, yeah, you could and I could be critical of the church, and there are things we, are critical of, I guess. But you've chosen not to go down that road, and you've chosen to just honor people's individual journey. But if this helps you, and you want to stay, perhaps my story will help you. And there's very few stories like that out there. And you're right. A lot of our sort of, are agenda based. And I think that's why I think this is helpful. And I would guess, and I hope people picked up, in your earlier self where I think you described yourself as all in. It's not like you're writing this book to your earlier self to get you on the edge earlier. And you're not trying to get those people. You're not trying to move those people to where you are, which takes grace because you recognize that's where they are and you're giving them grace to be there. And you're not trying to say, okay, the purpose of my book is to move everybody where I am because you're going to be a lot happier. I'm going to be a lot happier because a lot more people are going to have communities. I think it's a real point of maturity and grace. So on behalf of our listeners and me personally, thank you. Listeners,
Can I pick up on your word maturity?
Yeah.
Because and if you even started into the book, you will know where I'm going. As I worked on this, in fact, I started the book from the center, which was the chapter on talking with the bishop, which I really think is thematically the core chapter, and dealing with a temple recommend interview and dealing with callings. And those were the things that you might expect to get when you pick up a book that's titled the way this is. But I learned a lot in doing the writing. And one of the things I came to understand, and then it became the philosophical underpinning of the whole book, is that the process that we're talking about, the process that I'm talking about, is really the process of growing up, becoming an adult, individuation. It becomes dealing with the church, dealing with the bishop, dealing with the council from General Conference, dealing with all of the institutional, as an adult, dealing with other adults in a conversation, as opposed to where I start the book out. Most churches, most institutional churches, are structured around a parent-child model, where the church is the parent telling the child, us, what to do. And for someone on the edge, I mean that that works for a lot of people, and that's fine. But for people on the edge who want to make it work, I think that's an um, intolerable situation. If you continue in the model of being the child in a structure where the church is a parent telling you what to do, you will kick yourself out, or you will just give up and shut down and take orders. Um, that's neither one of those is life on the inside of the edge. And so the philosophical underpinning of the whole book is grow up, individuate, create an adult self who then deals with the church, with the institution, with the bishop as an adult in an adult to adult conversation. That doesn't tell you that you don't do what they say. It tells you that you take it under advisement, in effect. It also tells you an adult behavior is one that, picking up on things you just said, Richard, that allows other people their space and allows other people their own journey and recognizes that they are where they are. And I don't need to be critical of that. If they want to move, I can provide some advice or some of my own experience. But I don't have any business telling other people where they should live their lives or how they should live their lives. I'm in the business here of answering questions and of offering alternatives, not of dictating or becoming a substitute father figure. I don't want to take the church as father figure and turn it into me as father figure. That would be the height of arrogance and it would be a fatal mistake. It's just the wrong way to go.
It's very thoughtful. Talk about, listeners, I'm looking at the chapters, and these are not all written by Chris. You've got some of my friends that have written chapters like James Jones, David Doyle, and others. Introduce our listeners to why you had other people write chapters and an overview of those chapters.
Well, I'd like to say, and it's sort of true, that from the very beginning, I knew that, first of all, I wanted to be present in this book. I wanted to be genuine and real. And I knew that while I had a valuable platform from which to speak, having been fully inside and decades on the edge, I wasn't all things. And so I looked for people who had an important voice that isn't mine. I also had encouragement. I mean, people are laudatory of that approach. People will say, I heard it the other day, you took your privilege, which is tremendous. I have a tremendous I'm in a privileged position in 20 different ways. I'm an old white man with a history, with a church heritage and pedigree. All those things, come together. But you took that privileged platform and platformed other people. And I know that's, I didn't think that way, but it's true. And I'll take credit for doing that because I did honestly think I need these voices. I need these voices. And so I went looking for them. I mean, people have said good and you should and all that, but I'm going to take credit for having thought it was important from the first instance. And so we have a woman's point of view. We have a Black man's point of view. We have a single woman's point of view. We have a gay man's point of view. It was an interesting process finding people who can write, who have a powerful voice themselves, who also live in this liminal space of knowing the issues, of being very, very well aware of the problems and the challenges, and yet have chosen for the time being to stay and to work on making it work so that they are both my audience and my speakers. and we can stand on that platform together. I mean, they are wonderful. I mean, I ended up thinking, let's do this book just so that these essays can get out. These essays can get published. I mean, each one is powerful. There is an interesting phenomenon that has happened, which is people read and come back to me and say, that essay, that told the whole story. That could have been the whole book, or that one really touched me. Or I read that one and I was in tears for 2 days. I mean, all those kinds of reactions. But what's interesting is it's almost everybody who comes back is coming back with a different one. And sometimes it's obvious, like you're a single woman, and so that essay by a single woman is going to touch you. Sometimes it is not so obvious. Sometimes it's like, oh, that was my son's experience, and now I understand him better. Or, I mean, there are different connections. I mean, there is one I come back to. There's an essay that we titled "Raising Feminist Boys in a Sexist Church." I'll tear up here. I don't know whether that will show up in the recording or not, but that essay was written by my daughter-in-law, and I tear up every time I read it. I mean, I love all these essays. They're powerful. I love the people who have written them. I'm just so enthusiastic. But that essay, when you get to near the end, where Anne talks about what she wants for those boys, what she's trying to do for those boys. Those are my grandsons she's talking about, and I want that for those boys. That's how it strikes me. That's the one that grabs me because it gets personal. It gets to be about my grandsons, and I think every reader who's come back to me with a reference to those essays has something similar. That one grabbed me because it was my experience, or it was my daughter's experience, or it was close to my life in a way that's important. And I think that's so powerful. I couldn't have done that. I mean, I couldn't write those. I mean, I think I credit myself with pretty much understanding all the issues and concerns that each of those writers talks about. I mean, I'm not oblivious to the world and the tensions and the struggles, but it's not my voice, and I could not have written my voice would sound like an academic analyzing and discussing. And so, the only essay I contributed there is about my own children. And that's my voice about my children. And everyone else is someone talking about their life, their experience, and it's powerful in that way.
That was a beautiful segment. You got a big heart when I hear you talk about your grandsons and your daughter-in-law, Ann Bennett. And listeners, I'm just going to read these just so you know the sections. I think Chris is calling them essays. One's Woman's Perspective, Susan Hinckley.
In the book, we pitched them as chapters.
Chapters.
They each wrote it as an essay, and then because it worked the structure of the book, it's a chapter in the book. But that's, yeah.
The next one is The Inside of the Edge for Single Adults, Myra Haslam. Living on the Inside of the Edge, A Gay Latter-day Saint Perspective, David Doyle. Black and Mormon, Activism to Survive, James Jones. And then there's 4 listeners that are Complicated Families. Complicated Families, Raising Children on the Edge. That's Chris Kimball. He mentioned that. Complicated Families, Raising Feminist Boys in a Sexist Church. Your daughter-in-law, Ann Bennett, that you reference with a big heart. And I love how much you care about your grandchildren, all of them. Complicated Families, LGBTQ Children, Shari Siebers Crawl, if I'm saying her name right, and Complicated Families, Pushing Orthodoxy as the Cemeterian's Daughter. And say her name for us so I get it right.
Kaisa.
Kaiser Berlin.
Berlin Kafusi.
Kyla Berlin Kafusi. So thank you. I think, Chris recognizes, and I have sort of the same privileges. What can we do with our privilege to amplify the voices of others? So I love how you modeled that in your book. Listeners, just a little bit about my story and how it parallels a little bit about Chris. It was the policy statements that were jarring to me. That was probably my 25-year ago event. And I ended up in a slightly different place than Chris. I hold a temple recommend and fully participate in the church. And I don't want to say Chris doesn't fully participate in the church. And we just give each other space. None of us look as lost or more in or more out. We're just two men on our journey. But Chris said some things. This is what helped me stay in the church. And it comes back to Chris's, it's you're either all or in or you're other. This binary we sometimes have, but getting away from that binary was key to helping me stay in the church. And my wife helped me because she just walked with me and just loved me and supported me. I went to my stake president, my resident stake president. I was serving as a YSA bishop during the time, and he gave me permission to have a couple fallen dominoes. And usually when all our dominoes fall, one falls, they all fall. That's sort of the imagery of dominoes. But he gave me nuance. He said, I'm not going to make my relationship with you about standing up your fallen dominoes. Let's talk about your dominoes that you still believe in and sort of make your way forward. And I've always kind of thought, Chris, I'll figure out a way someday to stand those fallen dominoes. But no, they never have. I just continue with fallen dominoes and standing dominoes. And I don't think that'll ever change me. Or said another way, I'm going to never go back to where I was pre-policy statements, just like you probably never go back to where you were. And then your Facebook group. So Geraldine vetted me. In 2016, I looked it up, and you were part of that group, and that's how I connected with you. And you were a very seasoned voice, and there's a lot. I don't want to, rank you above the others, but you were very helpful for me because your story was a little bit like me. And Jerry Lilly did such a great job. She's been on a couple podcasts vetting me, but it is exactly what you said. It took a little bit of time to vet me. And Jerry Lee was wondering if I was coming in there to save everybody else and that had questions and be prescriptive. But no, she recognized that I just needed the community. But the community gave me tools just like, and this is about listeners to read Chris's book. If you're like me and you want to stay, and you're looking for a kind of a non-prescriptive voice to share their story and also principles that perhaps can help you stay, there's not a lot of books in this space. And that's one of the reasons I see it, being one of the top books on Amazon for LDS readers. And I think it'll stay that way for quite a while. My feeling is that books in this space, there's so few. Whenever there's a book that comes along, it sort of has a long shelf life. You may do edition 2 in 5 years. So I'm just grateful for Chris and what he's done. I want to go back to listeners that are angry. And you were angry, and I've been angry, and you were also silent. And I'm not a therapist, but that seems like a hard spot to be in, both angry and silent. And you were able to stay in that space for a period of time, and maybe you weren't silent in individual conversations, and that allowed you to sort of live with anger, and maybe you weren't completely silent, but you're silent at church. Talk to listeners that are angry and or silent, and maybe that's in your book, but how they can navigate that.
Well, it's interesting. There is a chapter in the book about anger, and it basically says, see a therapist. No, it actually says two different things. And that's part of the answer. In that period when I was angry and silent, that silence has to do with the church and the church community. I mean, I was in regular on the couch therapy, therapy, and that was very important. And I would recommend it. And I know it's hard to find, and I know it's hard to afford. But that's I don't think that's the church's business, and I don't think it's the community's business. And that's basically what I say in the chapter about anger, is that the church community, in my experience, does not know what to do with anger, does not handle it very well. And therefore, for us who are angry and still trying to be engaged, what we need to do is a Stoic approach, which is to not act out of anger, but to act out of principle, to act out of a rational decision making, because the church and the church community pretty much universally, in my experience, deals with anger as if it's at least a short-term mental break and mental illness, and will just exclude you. We'll treat it as your problem. So for purposes of the church community, what I preach is don't act out of anger. Take it elsewhere, get therapy, deal with it. It's not a good thing. It's something you should work with, but the church community is not the place to do that. It's just not equipped and not able. And frankly, I don't think bishops are generally able or equipped or trained to deal with anger. That, to me, is related to this overall pitch I make to grow up, to be an adult about it. That is, not to expect of the church all things, not to expect the church to change to be the way I want it to be, but to take the church and the church community as what they are right now, in process, in work, but probably not changing as fast as you want them to. And so deal with the church and the church community as it is. Ask for what it can provide, and go elsewhere for what you need that is not regularly or easily available from the church. That's very much different, but consistent with different from the norm, what you hear from the church, different from what you hear, we're everything, we can do everything for you. I don't believe that, and I don't believe it works for people who are trying to live on the inside of the edge. The church simply is not all things to all people. And so and that's a long way around.
That's a good answer.
Of saying, I don't think the church is very good about anger, and I'd go find a professional therapist.
Yeah, and I recognize church can generate pain, and pain can lead to anger, and it's hard then to turn back to the church community if it's the source of the pain that leads to the anger. I think anger is generally a secondary emotion to pain, and if that originates from the church community in some way, then I love Chris's advice to sort of adultly deal with that by turning to other sources to get through that. And perhaps even the atonement can help heal you at some point. There is an idea that Christ descended below things, and it's not sin related, but it's just pain related. And it's a long journey. I feel some of those same things, Chris, and still do. And so your story is not a lot different than mine. I've always felt, and Chris is teaching this, that we're all cafeteria Mormons, and we shouldn't weaponize that statement. We're all work in process, and which church should not be a place where we're sifting each other based on this or that. I've always felt the gate is wide, and I think Elder Uchtdorf teaches this. The gate's wide at the congregation level. There shouldn't be a belief or behavior hurdle. You don't need a temple recommend to walk in the door of a chapel or any other sort of hurdle. And we should not look at people by their station in any way in our congregations. And let's honor their personal journeys. And I think our job as fellow Latter-day Saints, just love and support and accept and learn from people. And this doctrine of belonging that Elder Christofferson, I think it applies to people like Chris that are walking, and me and many others that are walking the inside of the edge. They need to feel like they belong, and not that they'll just belong when they kind of get right back in the middle where maybe the majority of the members are. But that's just some of my thoughts, Chris. And I'm going to, listeners, I'm going to turn it back to Chris for any final comments. But just for the show notes, we'll link to Chris's book, obviously, on Amazon. We'll link to this Waters of Mormon group. We did talk about that in episode 592 with Gerald E. Renshaw and Peter Ryan, if you're familiar. It's the same group we're talking about. Also, shout out to Steve Evans at BBC Press and all the people at BCC Press that are working to bring books like this forward. and the work you're doing in our faith community. And just remember what Chris talked about with Steve Evans. We need a book to help people stay. And even though you don't want to say this is a book to help people stay because you don't want to be prescriptive, this is still a book for those that want to stay, to have tools to help them stay. And listeners, if you feel impressed and you're right in the middle, but you want to help people stay that are on the edge, I'm going to use living on the edge. Sometimes a book like this can give you more tools. I've always felt, I'm talking too much, the toolbox to bring people in the church, read, pray, and go to church may be different than the toolbox to help people stay in the church that want to stay in the church. And this book, even though Chris isn't sort of saying it's for you, you might feel impressed to pick up this book as a local leader, as a parent, even a parent of younger kids. You want to have better tools as they age up. This book you may find really helpful. Its goal isn't to move you to the edge of the inside from the middle or whatever we're describing that space, but give you tools to minister to those in a more effective way than on the inside of the edge. So with that, I'll turn it back to Chris for as long a closing segment as you want to do, my friend.
I just wanted to pick up. In fact, you gave me the perfect segue there, because I wanted to end with a little more comment about audience. We've talked about the target audience, the people I know and knew when I was writing, and they know who they are and they find the book. I continue to be, and we've talked about this a little bit, Richard, interested in the extended audience, the rest of us, or the rest of you. And so I think let me parse that a little bit in just a couple of minutes. It seems to me that people who have left the church are probably not interested and probably will never pick up the book. And if they do, the first couple of pages will probably tell them, put it back down. Seems to me that the people who are really all in, loyal, happy, probably are not in the spaces where they'll even hear about this book. And that's fine. And they probably have no interest, and that's fine. There's a middle crowd that I've come across who are curious, who are kind of, what is this middle way people are talking about? What is this about? Maybe if you're curious, you pick up the book. Frankly, I think 300 plus pages is a little heavy. If you're just casually curious, I'm not going to try to sell it to you. That it's probably too much. But there are two audiences that I'm really interested in approaching. And in my head, I call them the parents and the bishops. The parents, and that's a general term, it's just my label, are friends and family of members in crisis. They're friends and family who really care and really love those people who are my target audience, who are in crisis, who are wanting a way to stay. I think this book is not addressed to you. You won't hear, it won't sound like I'm talking to you at all. If you read, it will be like watching another world from the side, but I think it will provide a really important, valuable insight into what's going on in your son's life, in your brother's life, in the life of, I just gave a copy to a friend of mine who is not in the target audience, but he immediately said, my sister needs this, and I'm going to read it to understand her better.
That's cool.
That's an important audience, and I want to get the word to that audience, what I label parents, but of course it's broader than that. And the last one is the bishops, which are church leaders, bishops, stake presidents, probably at that, especially at that local level, whose work touches individual members' lives on a daily basis. Not just church leaders who are curious, not the leaders who are checking out to see if I criticize them. I mean, of course, some people are going to pick it up and look to see if I dissed on what you just said in conference last week, but I didn't do very much of that. But if you want to look, go ahead. But that's not who I'm talking to. I'm talking about the bishops and the stake presidents who have a genuine desire to be pastoral, to help, to succor, to listen, to support their members in their wards and stakes who are in the struggle. And I really believe I'm not selling, I didn't write for this purpose, but I believe you will find value in this book. If that's you, if you have an interest in being that kind of pastoral leader, I think you'll learn something.
That was great. Chris, on behalf of all of our listeners, thank you. You are very good on a podcast. I can tell you've done a lot of legal work and taught a lot, but you have a pastoral heart when you talked about your daughter-in-law. And I can tell this whole book is about love and your love for our community and your love for people that are walking the same road that we're walking. And your love to give pastoral tools to local leaders to be able to better support people walking this road that want to do the right thing, but just haven't been given sometimes the right tools, the right framework to do that. So please, listeners, check out this book, share it with others. And this is Richard Ostler and Chris Kimball signing off from another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.